Good evening and welcome to CYC News for today, the 22nd of November 2015 and the 12th of Hatur, 1732 AM. I'm Angie Victor. In today's headlines, ISIS video threatens New York City. Mayor says the city won't be intimidated. Beirut mourns its dead. Weather comparisons to Paris. 2 killed and 8 held after France raid, but suspected ringleader's status is unknown. John Kerry defends Syria strategy ahead of peace talks. Europe wants G20 to help with refugee crisis, and how the Hunger Games franchise changed Hollywood. Before we commence our regular news, on Wednesday, November 18, the Coptic Orthodox Church celebrated the 3rd anniversary of His Holiness Pope Tawadros II's enthronement as the 118th Pope and current Pope of Alexandria and Patriarch of the See of St. Mark. Congratulations to Your Holiness, and may God prolong your life for many more peaceful years. On to our top story. Following the Paris attacks last week, a new video released by ISIS warns of an impending attack on New York City. The video mentions Times Square and purports to show an explosive device being put together and a bomber zipping his jacket over a suicide belt. The New York City Police Department said it was aware of the video and was deploying additional members of its new anti-terrorism squad out of an abundance of caution. While some of the video footage is not new, the video reaffirms the message that New York City remains a top terrorist target, the statement said. While there is no current or specific threat to the city at this time, we will remain at a heightened state of vigilance and will continue to work with the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the entire intelligence community to keep the city of New York safe. Mayor Bill de Blasio encouraged New Yorkers to go about their normal business. The people of New York City will not be intimidated, he said. We understand that it is the goal of terrorists to intimidate and disrupt our democratic society. We will not submit to their wishes. As buildings lit up in the colors of the French flag and the 129 people killed in Paris on Friday filled headlines, many people in Beirut felt the West and its news media had forsaken them. A day before the French attacks, 2 suicide bombers had killed 43 people and wounded 239 more in the Lebanese capital in an ISIS-propagated murder. The explosions detonated within 150 meters and 5 minutes of each other in the Burj al-Barjina district in southern Beirut on Thursday, Lebanon's state-run national news agency said. But on Friday, Western cameras turned away, focusing intently on France. It threw Western media's reporting into sharp relief, with strong criticism leveled at what some saw as hugely uneven coverage of the 2 assaults. The global outpouring of sympathy did the same. Many of the world's monuments illuminated in the blue, white, and red of France's tricolor. The Lebanese flag, however, was not afforded the same treatment. When my people died, no country bothered to light up its landmarks in the colors of their flag, Eli Faris, a Lebanese doctor, wrote on his blog. When my people died, they did not send the world into mourning. Their death was but an irrelevant fleck along the international news cycle, something that happens in those parts of the world. Social media users also noted the disparate attention focused on Paris over the Middle Eastern city. French authorities took the offensive, raiding a purported hideout of the suspected ringleader in last week's deadly Paris attacks in an operation that ended with 8 detained, 2 dead, and potentially more bloodshed thwarted. But what about that suspected ringleader, Abdelhamid Abaoud? According to Paris prosecutor François Molin, at one point, authorities believe he was holed up on the 3rd floor of an apartment building in the northern Paris suburb of Saint-Denis. If he was there when scores of heavily armed French police launched their assault at 4:20 a.m. on Wednesday is unknown. Some residents in the area told CNN they saw Abaoud recently in the neighborhood and at a local mosque. Investigators zeroed in on the building after picking up phone conversations indicating that a relative of Abaoud might be there. They met fierce resistance from the start, including an armored door, a woman who blew herself up, and bullets flying back and forth for an hour. The French officers even used powerful weaponries, which led to one floor of the building collapsing. That violence produced rubble that included body parts on which investigators are conducting DNA tests. Mourns said that neither Abaoud nor suspect Salah Abdeslam, for whom authorities have been hunting since the attacks, were among those detained in the operation. French President François Hollande held up the vicious back and forth as further proof that we are at war with ISIS. What the terrorists were targeting was what France represents. This is what was attacked on the night of November 13, he said. These barbarians targeted France's diversity. It was the youth of France who were targeted simply because they represent life. ISIS first drew international attention for taking over swathes of Iraq and Syria, leaving a trail of violence and destruction in its wake. And its efforts to bring the terror to the global stage seems to be growing. This month alone, ISIS has claimed responsibility for the Paris attacks, the downing of a Russian passenger jet in Egypt, and a pair of suicide bombings in Beirut. France had already been part of the US-led coalition fighting ISIS with airstrikes, but the country has stepped up its efforts since the series of shootings and explosions in Paris last week, which killed 129 people. US Secretary of State John Kerry laid out the United States' 3 goals to end the Syrian conflict one day before Kerry and his international counterparts prepare to reconvene for the next round of negotiations on Syria's fate. Kerry said the Obama administration remains committed to defeating ISIS, to containing the Syrian conflict within that country's borders, and intensifying diplomatic efforts to end the Syrian civil war, which he said has been a central concern of the US government. Kerry's speech at the US Institute of Peace comes as the White House has faced a steady stream of criticism from Republicans and other critics, accusing the administration of lacking a strategy to defeat ISIS and quell regional turmoil. In comments aimed at those who say the US has done too little, Kerry publicized the progress of US-led coalition in bombing ISIS targets over the last 14 months, pointing to the ouster of ISIS from the Syrian border town of Kobani and the Iraqi city of Tikrit, the killing of top ISIS leaders, and the humanitarian mission that helped save members of the Yazidi minority under threat from ISIS last summer. But Kerry primarily focused on the need to make headway on the diplomatic front, where the US has struggled to move the ball forward on transitioning Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from power and creating a more inclusive government. Europe is struggling again. Its economy is slowing, and hundreds of thousands of refugees are pouring over its borders, according to the CNN Money website. It reports that feeble global growth and the migration crisis will dominate talks this weekend between leaders of the world's top 20 developed and emerging economies. But the chances of the G20 summit in Turkey resulting in anything other than a well-intentioned statement look slim, given the big powers have different priorities. Europe wants migration near the top of the agenda. It is calling for the world to share the burden of accepting refugees, many of whom are fleeing war in Syria. The G20 must rise to the challenge and lead a coordinated and innovative response to the crisis that recognizes its global nature and economic consequences and promotes greater intentional solidarity in protecting refugees, the European Union said in a statement. Europe's economy may actually benefit from the influx of migrants in the medium term thanks to increased government spending on services to support them and boosts they'll give to the region's labor. The Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development estimates that migration could lift Germany's working-age population by 1% over the next 2 years and add up to 0.2% to European GDP over the same period. The EU has committed 9.5 billion euros, about $10 billion, to helping member states absorb the refugees and has offered 2.9 billion euros, or $3 billion, to Turkey to stem the flow coming out of Turkey and into Europe. It wants G20 countries to commit to making more funds available to aid agencies dealing with the crisis. Canada, for one, has already committed to increasing aid to the United Nations Refugee Agency and has vowed to take in 25,000 Syrians by the end of the year. But Europe may find it tough to convince the United States, Russia, and China that it's a global issue and therefore appropriate for the G20 to tackle. A new issue of ISIS online magazine Dabik contains what it claims is a picture of the bomb that brought down a Russian passenger jet over Egypt's Sinai Peninsula last month. The photograph shows a soft drink can and two components that appear to be a detonator and a switch, according to explosives expert Anthony May. There is a hole in the bottom of the can, which reveals a white substance inside that could be explosives, he said. The detonator would be placed through the hole. The three components appear to constitute a suicide-type bomb because the bomber would have to flip the single-throw rocker switch to detonate the bomb. May also acknowledge the apparent simplicity and lethality of the bomb. It doesn't take much to bring down a plane in flight if it's placed in the most critical area of the aircraft, breaking the fuselage, said May, who was actually a retired explosives enforcement officer with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. He believed that because the can is made of metal, any typical security protocol should detect this via the metal detectors or via the X-rays in an airport. However, it's not unlikely or impossible to separate these components and an individual carry a separate component through security and then assemble the device on the other side. Beijing has vowed to bring ISIS to justice after the group said it had executed two hostages, a Chinese and a Norwegian. ISIS said it had killed the two men, identified as Chinese national Fan Jingwei and Norwegian citizen Ole Johan Grimsgaard Ofstad, in its English-language online magazine Dabik. President Xi Jinping strongly condemned ISIS for the killing of Fan, the first known Chinese national to be killed by the group, and the country's foreign minister said the Chinese government would definitely hold the perpetrators accountable. But how to respond to Fan's cold-blooded and violent death presents a dilemma for China, which has stayed on the sidelines in the fight against ISIS and has had a long-held principle of non-interference in other countries' affairs. To date, Beijing has been vague on the question of what it will contribute to the global fight against ISIS and has declined to explicitly offer its support for airstrikes being conducted against the group in Syria. Norway also condemned the killings. We have no grounds to doubt the contents of the photos that have been published, Foreign Minister Borge Brende said, according to Reuters. Russia is one of 6 countries to be deemed non-compliant by the World Anti-Doping Agency in the wake of a report that accused its athletics federation of running a state-sponsored doping program. Along with Argentina, Ukraine, and Bolivia, it has been found guilty of using non-accredited laboratories to produce its urine and blood sample analysis, the agency said in a statement on its website. Andorra and Israel were found not to have adequate anti-doping rules in place, while Brazil, host of the 2016 Olympics, is among 6 more countries to be put on the agency's watch list. Should it, along with Belgium, France, Greece, Mexico, and Spain, not meet the agency's conditions by March next year, they could all be deemed non-compliant. Kenya, the subject of a doping investigation by the International Association of Athletics Federations, has been told to detail its doping controls or face sanctions. Meanwhile, the federation laid out its criteria for Russia to be readmitted to athletics after it was provisionally banned for doping violations. Russia was accused of fostering a deeply rooted culture of cheating at all levels in an independent report carried out by the organization's former president, Dick Pound. It claimed more than 1,400 samples were intentionally and maliciously destroyed by a Moscow laboratory, even after an agency plea to preserve them. Athletes were often given notice of out-of-competition tests, used false identities, and frequently bribed doping control officers to get around other tests. Pound's report also stated that the London 2012 Olympics, in which Russia won 24 gold medals, were in a sense sabotaged by the admission of athletes who should not have been competing. The International Olympic Committee, President Thomas Bach, said at the weekend he was confident Russia would resolve its problems in time to compete at Rio 2016. But IAAF President Seb Coe, who was criticized for not doing more to uncover Russia's doping issues, has warned it will only be readmitted once it passes robust tests. Russia must make doping illegal, ban those athletes and coaches that have been implicated, and end the omerta that has surrounded its practices, a statement on the IAAF's website said. Well, it looks like Earth is already halfway to the danger zone. Less than 2 weeks before a crucial global climate summit in Paris kicks off, NOAA, NASA, and other global temperature monitors released data showing the planet is halfway to 2 degrees of warming, the much-publicized limit of controllable climate change. Global data from NOAA released on Thursday shows that the average temperature across the entire planet for the month of October was a record-shattering 0.98 degrees Celsius, warmer than average for the month of October, making it the highest average temperature reached compared to normal in Earth's historical record. When Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 hits theaters, it will bring to a close one of the most successful film franchises in recent history. The first 3 films grossed over $2.3 billion worldwide, launched careers, and started trends. Here are just some of the ways The Hunger Games has changed Hollywood. We now have Jennifer Lawrence. Her casting was hotly contested in 2011 by fans who loved the book trilogy by Suzanne Collins. The then 20-year-old was seen by some as too old to portray 16-year-old Katniss Everdeen, who heroically fights in the dystopia known as Panem, where children battle each other to the death to entertain the masses. But as soon as Lawrence hit the screen with her side ponytail, bow and arrows, she was a hit. With her down-to-earth nature, she quickly became America's newest sweetheart, and she recently topped Vulture's list of most valuable stars for the 2nd year in a row. Her big studio box office record is unimpeachable, and every one of the studio executives we polled gave Lawrence their highest rating, the publication said of Lawrence. Put very simply, she is the leading movie star of her generation. And that's all for CYC News for today. Stay tuned for more Christian content on CYC. I'm Angie Victor, and from the CYC studios in Sydney, Australia, good night and God bless.